Welcome to Spiritual Directions with Father Joseph Matlak and Father Joshua Voitus. Join them each week as they unpack the timeless wisdom of our forebears in the faith and show you how it points you toward a greater Christian life.
Welcome back to the Spiritual Directions podcast. Last week, if you remember, we talked about Ignatius of Antioch. We talked about his letters to the various churches. We read some from his letter to the Ephesians. I encourage you, obviously in a podcast, we only have so much we can go into. And so I hope some of the things that we do on this podcast does is kind of inspires you to go read more deeply in this. I would encourage you, and I didn't mention this the last time, but in my opinion anyway, Ignatius, along with John Chrysostom, actually, are, if you're going to start in the church fathers, they're kind of some of the easiest places to start. They're very clear reading. Chrysostom is very clear. He's very direct. Ignatius is the same way, also is very brief, which makes it a kind of a relatively easy way to get into reading the church fathers. Last week we talked about some of his discussion of unity and the hierarchical structure of the church. I've heard a number of people that were maybe Protestants, maybe a member of kind of a non-hierarchical church, who read Ignatius and read, his discussion of the hierarchy and everything, and how early it was, how this was the very early church, the earliest non-biblical writings. And they said, wow, this sounds a lot like the Catholic Church or even the Orthodox Church, and not like kind of non-hierarchical kind of modern Protestantism. And so they kind of became Catholic because they encountered that through Ignatius. And so Ignatius remains both inspirational for us in terms of, how we're to kind of handle authority, how we're to handle the hierarchy, how we're to handle all kind of the various levels and stages of hierarchy that we're in, but also is a very, I believe, powerful tool for evangelization, especially. And so I encourage you to go read more of him, more of those letters. Today, we're going to actually focus down on one of his letters in particular. We're going to focus on his letter to the Romans, because like I said last week, it has a very different kind of flavor to it, a very different subject matter. He doesn't really get into kind of hierarchical structure that much. He doesn't really get into unity as a thing. It's going to sound bad, and hopefully I'm not kind of saying something too weird, but because all of his letters are, of course, spiritual, because they're about union with God. But this seems a much more kind of deeply spiritual, and maybe what I'm thinking is a deeply personal letter that Ignatius writes, because in it he's writing about his own martyrdom. Because, like I said, it was strange in the ancient world. We'll say it's still part of the ancient world. It's kind of strange, and it's different than how we think about it, because generally the way we think about it is a lot of these things happen quickly. Transportation happens quickly. When somebody's in prison, it's very hard to go see them. There's security checks. What's happening then in the ancient world is he's receiving visitors. The traveling is quite slow. And by this point, and I don't think it's clear like where he's writing from. He's not in Rome yet, right, when he's writing this. Most of the other letters he's writing either while he's in the city or right after he's left the city and sending the letter back. This one, he's not in Rome yet, but it is clear from the letter that the church in Rome like kind of knows that he's coming, right? And they know that he's going to be martyred. And you kind of get the sense from the letter, at least, that I don't think celebrity is maybe the right word, but he's well known. Like he's a prominent person. We talked last week about how the bishops of Antioch are successors to St. Peter. The ancients would have kind of known that. They would have recognized that, as being somewhat significant. And so they knew he was coming.
Yeah. And imagine going somewhere knowing that there's a very good chance that you will die by going there. Just last night, I heard one of our brother priests preached a homily to the retreatants, the Quo Vadis retreat.
Oh, yes.
For the young men who are discerning, vocations, I think of all kinds, right? But he focused in on the priesthood. And in the homily, he quoted, and I was very happy about this, he quoted the English martyrs. And he pointed out to the young men who were on retreat that after Henry VIII and all that happened in England, the English martyrs would go to France and to Rome to pursue their seminary studies, very often knowing that once they were done, they would be sent back. and he mentioned something about, I think some of the martyrs went to St. Philip Neri and received his blessing before they departed for England, and he referred to them as martyrs before they left.
Yeah.
So imagine that, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that you're
Sure.
going to die.
Absolutely. And him knowing, especially that because he's not thinking he's going to Rome to preach and maybe is going to he's already caught. Like it's just a matter of time.
Yes.
And so whether this was the case or not, it seems like what Ignatius thought might be happening, right? I don't know that he knew that he had received some kind of plans, that the Roman Church might have been planning kind of a heist. And it would be an interesting movie, a kind of heist, a kind of a rescue of him, to kind of to break in, sneak him out, and to kind of save him, right? And that makes sense, right? If I would imagine, if they were kind of hauling the bishop away, like my bishop away, and it was a persecution against Christians and Christianity's illegal and they're going to haul the bishop away, I can see, a group of the laity and some of the priests getting together. It's like, all right, how are we going to spring him?
Yeah.
I would hope, enough of my parishioners had enough affection for me that they would kind of think maybe the same thing if I was being hauled away to be executed. And the interesting thing is about this letter to the Romans is that's what he's writing to them about mainly. He's writing to them about, I know I'm coming.
Yeah.
I know that I'm going to be killed, and I know that you might be trying to rescue me. And basically the idea of the letter is, to sum it up, is don't.
Yes.
Do not, under any circumstances, try to rescue me, which is an almost shocking thing to say.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of one of the martyrs of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church of the 20th century. For those of you who don't know, so I'm a member of that church, a priest of that church. And it was the largest underground organization in the world, religious organization in the world under the Soviet Union. Oppressed, sent to the gulags. All the bishops went to Siberia, asked to renounce their Catholic faith. They all refused. They were sent to Siberia, to the gulags, to Kazakhstan. And then eventually it sort of came out of the underground in 1991 with the opening of the fall of the Soviet Union. And Pope John Paul II canonized 20-odd of the martyrs. And one of them, he was a priest, Emilian Kovch was his name. He was declared the patron saint of Greek Catholic parish priests, but he ended up in a concentration camp, Majdanek, in Poland. And somehow they persuaded the authorities to release him. And he actually wrote a letter to his family saying, don't do this because I'm the only Catholic priest in this camp. He was baptizing all kinds of people and ministering to them. So he was actually saying to them, don't do this, even though he could get out. That's very powerful. And I think that priests, as well as any Christian, should meditate on that.
Yeah, I mean, because he recognized, and we talked about last week in the hierarchy, the weight of the responsibility that you take on. And he recognized that. He recognized these people need someone to baptize. They need someone to forgive them their sins. They need a spiritual father, not even just the immediate sacramental needs, but they need a spiritual father. You see that too. I was reading something very briefly the other day on, I think it was 3 priests on the Titanic who were offered seats on lifeboats. And they said, no, these people who are going to die, they need us, or are we going to think Maximilian Kolbe, in the concentration camps again, these were men who understood their mission, and their mission was not as to administrate something. Their mission was not to be kind of a CEO of the church business, but their mission was to provide that sacramental needs and provide that spiritual fatherhood, right? And ultimately to become, and you mentioned this very briefly last week, but to become an icon of Christ, to become an icon of Christ who didn't necessarily on a human level desire to be crucified, but also who did not run from that, who did not run away, who did not, but who bore that for the sake of mankind. And these priests kind of understand that by bearing that, just as Ignatius understood, by bearing that burden, and whether it's a burden to death in those cases, or just the burden of the difficulties in ministry sometimes, to continue to bear that burden, is how we become an icon of Christ.
Yes.
You know, by taking up our cross daily, whether it's a cross, you know, the very obvious cross of, you know, suffering and dying in a gulag or in a concentration camp, or just the burdens of, you know, you know this, it feels weird to compare it to what they did, but just like the burdens of day-to-day ministry, which can be difficult sometimes too.
Burdens of day-to-day family living.
Yes.
Everyone can identify with this.
Like so parents, this is how you become an icon of Christ for your children, you know, by bearing with that. You know, it's like I said last week, in the kind of like the fractal pattern of this hierarchy, and how whenever you cut, you know, somebody else, then the hierarchy repeats itself, you know, and all of these things. And even in our own selves, you know, our intellect and our will standing at the head of the hierarchy over our passions to inform and direct, you know, just the single human body, you know, like it continues to repeat over and over again.
Yes.
But in all of those things, and so we can become images of Christ to our parish, to our family, to the world, right? And that's what we're all meant to be, because we're all made in the image and likeness of God. And so all to become an icon of Christ, right? Before we get into actually reading some of Ignatius's letter to the Romans, we'll take a little break, and then we'll come back, because I want to read more of this letter, because like I said last week, it does, and I'm going to try not to get choked up, but we have editors. So if I do, you'll never know it. But we'll have a little break, and we'll be right back.
Usually, going to confession is uncomfortable and embarrassing. Even after decades of going, it usually doesn't get any easier. Furthermore, you probably haven't been taught anything about confession since you were 7, so your questions are still unanswered. Until now. In response to popular demand, we at Good Catholic have created a simple, straight-to-the-point mini-series that covers your most common questions and concerns, called Understanding Confession. There are 6 simple sessions, and we will give you confidence, peace of mind, and a new zeal for this sacrament. We'll give you tips on how to overcome fear and shame, the 3 things you need for a good confession, clarity on what actually constitutes mortal sin, and much, much more. So join us and our friend, Father Ken Geraci, to dive into this powerful sacrament of mercy. Click the link in the description or sign up today at goodcatholic.com.
Right, now that we're back, I want to start off by reading part of the very beginning, and it gets to kind of what we were talking about, Ignatius saying no to these people, but understanding where they're coming from too. He says, you know, again, talking about he's about to arrive in Rome. From the beginning, it has been well ordered, if I may obtain grace and cling to my lot without hindrance to that end. Again, cling to my lot, my martyrdom. For I am afraid of your love, lest it should do me an injury. For it is easy for you to accomplish what you please, but it is difficult for me to attain God if you do not spare me under the pretense of carnal affection.
Yeah,
I like that. Spare me your rescue, because you rescuing me would be relatively easy, but me getting to heaven is much more difficult, and allowing me to be martyred will attain me heaven, will attain for me the more difficult of these tasks. And I say, if you do not spare me under the pretense of carnal affection, for your rescue of me, you're rescuing my body, and it's affection for my body. But if you have affection for my soul, you'll let me witness to Christ in this way.
Yeah, and how many people actually talk like that? If you rescue me from physical injury, then you will actually be injuring me.
Yeah, you will do me I'm afraid I'm afraid of your love, for it might do me an injury. Because again, and what Ignatius I think is getting at is, we don't see the whole picture of the human being, right? We see the physical. And that's not to say that we shouldn't, like, if you're kind of like walking down the street and there's a house on fire, somebody needs to be rescued from a car, you shouldn't say, well, I'm not going to rescue them out of a pretense for affection before they're, I'm going to let them, it's like, that's not what Ignatius is saying at all, and that's not what I'm saying at all. But there is this thing where it's easy for us to see the outward, and not see the inward. Yeah. One of the things I tell, because we have a branch of St. Vincent de Paul Society at this parish. It would be weird if we didn't. We're St. Vincent de Paul Parish. But what I tell them is I say, giving money is not necessarily helping. We need to make sure we're helping people.
Teach a man to fish,
Yes,
kind of thing?
Yeah. So if there's some way we can help them to get back on their feet, that's actually to be more helpful. I mean, some people you do need to give money to because they need money now. Otherwise, big problem is going to happen, But sometimes that's not helpful.
Yeah.
And so we pray for kind of that discernment, right? We pray for that, because, that's one of the things we have to do as Christians is discernment, the discernment to see the whole picture as God sees it. And that's what Ignatius is laying out. He's laying out what God sees here.
Right. And he's not saying that the desire to be free from suffering is in and of itself bad. I mean, we've saints have dealt with this over the millennia, right? What they're saying is, you can desire to be free from suffering, but ultimately it's the one who perseveres through it for the sake of righteousness,
Right.
for the sake of God.
You can desire to be free from suffering, but and we've talked about this before, that's not an option.
Right.
Like, you don't have to like the suffering.
Yes.
That's not what we're talking about, but to bear it for Christ.
Right.
Yeah,
It's not healthy to like suffering.
No. It's like, if you like it, then I guess it's not suffering, but if you're, that's just kind of weird. It's kind of like a mental illness, kind of thing. So what we're talking about is like Ignatius and ultimately what's going to happen to him is going to be eaten by lions. Like, he's not, if he's meeting new people and he's telling them his hobbies, he's saying, well, I like, obviously I'm a bishop and, and I like prayer and I like all this. But I also, my dream is really to be eaten by lions, that's that's not what he's saying, but he's saying to do this for the reason that I'm doing it. His desire is to be a witness to Christ, and this is how he's going to do that. The lions are a means to an end.
Yeah, in a sense, he's already died. He's died to himself
Absolutely
and to the world. And then what happens now is that he's already living for another, for God. And so his true happiness is beyond this world. And that's why he's so ready to die. Yeah. Because he's already given himself to God in spirit.
He's already more than a foot into heaven anyway.
Yes, he's already a martyr.
And he's just kind of like, I'm waiting. It's one of the things I like to say, and I just kind of interject it here. And as we read kind of a little bit more of him, we can kind of apply it to ourselves. And maybe I've said it in previous podcasts. I sometimes, because, we're doing the podcast, I'm preaching every day. I forget sometimes what I say where, but so bear with me if I repeat myself. But I say not everybody is called to be a martyr, true, right? We're not all going to shed our blood for Christ, but we're all called to strive to be spiritually in a place where if we were called upon to do it, we would. So in a certain sense, we are all called to have the heart of a martyr. We're all called to martyrdom. Just for relatively few will that actually happen physically.
Yes.
But we're all called to be martyrs.
Well, then the word martyr just means witness.
Right.
It means that you should be ready to witness to your faith. And St. Paul says this in the New Testament, always be ready to give an account for what the hope that is within you.
And that might be any number of things. I was talking to somebody in the parking lot of the church today. It was a police officer who pulled into the parking lot to do some paperwork, and a couple of people had said, they saw a police officer and I think he was down in the woods, and I kind of went over to say, like, is there something going on in the woods? He said, no, I was just stretching my legs and doing paperwork, But we got to talking because obviously he knew I was a priest, he knew it was a church. We got to talking about like kind of religious stuff. So sometimes giving an account is just like, hey, what is it that you believe? Or what is the deal with the Eucharist? Or like, what is, and sometimes it's going to be to give witness, to give an account is to die. Yes. And everything running the gamut in between of both of those things. And so it's what Paul is saying, be ready to give witness, to give testimony. He's saying be ready to die.
Yes.
Or anything else.
And it could mean something like be ready to die to the good reputation that you have earned because you are a Christian.
Or the position you have in your business.
Right.
The financial benefits that you have accrued, the place that you live,
Ignatius is saying what St. Paul says, I rejoice that I have been found worthy to suffer for Christ.
Yeah.
Most of us don't think that way.
Yeah, most of us think of it as kind of like oh no, like this is bad. But Ignatius is looking at it like, no, this is an opportunity. This is something that God has given me.
Right.
I'll read this section here. It says, I write to all the churches and impress upon them all that I shall willingly die for God unless you hinder me. Right? I'm willingly dying for God unless you stop me. You Romans stop me. Mm-hmm. I beseech of you not to show an unseasonable goodwill towards me. I like that, unseasonable goodwill.
Yeah.
Goodwill too early.
Right.
Out of season. You should want the greater good for me. Allow me to become food for the wild beasts, through whose instrumentality it will be granted me to attain to God. Again, instrumentality of the wild beasts. They're a means to an end. He's not interested in being eaten by lions, but he wants to go to God. I am the weed of God, and am ground by the teeth of the wild beasts, that I may be found the pure bread of God. Rather entice the wild beasts, that they may become my tomb, and may leave nothing of my body, so that when I have fallen asleep in death, I may not be found troublesome to anyone. Then shall I be a true disciple of Jesus Christ, when the world shall not see so much as my body. Entreat the Lord for me, that by these instruments I may be found a sacrifice to God. I do not, as Peter and Paul, issue commandments. I do not, as Peter and Paul, issue commandments to you. They were apostles of Jesus Christ, but I am the very least of believers. They were free as the servants of God, while I am even until now a servant. But when I suffer, I shall be the freedman of Jesus Christ, and shall rise again emancipated in him. And now being in bonds for him, I learn not to desire anything worldly or vain.
Yes, it reminds me of a time that someone who was imprisoned in the Soviet Union visited my parish and gave a presentation to the people. And I think one of the questions was, when did you finally feel free? And he responded, when I was finally arrested, because that was when I finally felt free from the shackles of doing things like running away and hiding and trying surreptitiously to survive. Finally, I could be myself. And it's strange, because you wouldn't think that. You would think that the most important thing at all costs is to avoid the suffering. When you were talking about the instrumentality, can I make a contemporary reference here?
Absolutely.
Immediately, what went to my mind was, it's not about the nail. If you've ever seen that video about the married couple.
Oh, yes, I have. Yes,
it's not about the nail.
It took me a second, but yes, I have. Yeah.
It's not about the nails. It's not about the lions. It's about the freedom that he has found in Christ.
Right. And he's found it, he says, already in the chains, in being arrested already. He's kind of found that. Now being in bonds for him, I have learned not to desire anything worldly or vain. That last line is I think so beautiful. And that leads to, this willingness to be martyred. I no longer desire anything of this world. I no longer want power or comfort or ease or money or anything else. I want nothing but God. Don't take that away from me.
I wonder, what would your advice be for people struggling? We live in a very wealthy culture, right? How can people start to live this in our culture?
I mean, one of the things we've talked about before is we've talked about it quite a bit, is fasting, right? Mm-hmm. To deprive yourself of those things. He says, now that I'm in chains, I no longer desire it because I can't have it, right? And that he's in a certain sense saying, like, now that it's taken away from me, I've learned to not desire it. The problem is when we're living kind of, it's almost like we're fish and this abundance is the water that we live in, right? We can't imagine life without it. We don't know how we would function without it. We can barely even see it because it's just the medium that we live in. To deprive ourselves of that because by fasting and depriving ourselves of that, fasting from food, fasting from technology, except for podcasts,
Yeah.
At least you said this
Thank
one. I keep going on about how people need to cut out technology, and I'm like, hell, not entirely. But to deprive ourselves of that is to allow ourselves, and in addition to like sacrificing something for God, but is allowing ourselves to see who we really are. In a sense, it's to step out of that medium, to say, like, I'm just not going to today, I'll leave it on in case there's an emergency or something, but I'm not going to like fool around on social media. I'm not going to mess around on my phone today for a day. You start to see how, first of all, how you don't need it at all, right? People live for thousands of years without social media and we're fine. In fact, we're happier than they are now, right? How we don't need the things that we think we need, and how outside of those things, outside of that material prosperity, is where we're going to find our happiness in relationships with other people. Because the thing is, and I don't want to get off on a rant right now, but we were talking about it the other day, that the more my relationships are kind of technological, the less I know how to have an actual relationship with a person.
I was going to say, and when you deprive yourself, then you can feel that pain, and that's a good pain.
Right. It's a good suffering because it leads to true freedom and it leads to true relationality. One of the things I was talking to this police officer in the parking lot this morning, right? Mm-hmm. And he says, he's like, I talk to, you go to high schools. I talk to, kids who are, struggling with various things, including crime, but other things too. And he and I were kind of comparing notes, and we were kind of both finding the same things, that like people today, children or otherwise, they don't know how to have proper relationships. They're unfulfilled. They're attached to so many things that are making them miserable, but they think that they're staving the misery off, right? It's like, it's this horrible lie. And to just step away from it, to in a certain sense, put yourself in bonds, as Ignatius is talking about, to take yourself out of that. So, because you'll find that if you remove yourself from it for long enough, you'll no longer desire it. You won't want it anymore. You don't want social media. You just think you do.
Talk to recovering addicts.
Yeah.
They thought that their life depended on this whatever thing.
Yeah, alcohol, drugs, pornography, whatever it was, because it feels like it's a part of you.
Yes.
And what happens, and the reason why Ignatius can be in chains and free, is because presumably, and we don't know what he was like as a youth, but presumably all of the things, even back then, almost 2,000 years ago, all the things that he thought he needed to be happy, he's realizing and saying, no, they were actually weighing me down.
Yeah.
They were a burden to me. They were kind of like, if you come rescue me, it's going to do me an injury. Those things that I thought I needed were harming me. But it's God. It's God. And he talks about, and we can't read the whole letter. I encourage you to go read it. It's not that long. It's obviously public domain. The copyrights have all long since ceased to be, which is why we can read it out loud here. But he talks about relationships with other people and how happy he is with other people. It's because it's other people and it's God. That's what makes us happy. That's what's going to make a human being happy. Ignatius understands that, and it's worth being in chains, and it's worth being torn to pieces by lions. It's certainly worth us putting our phone down for a little while.
Yeah.
And I think with that, perhaps over dramatic, but also accurate statement, we'll call it a week. May God bless. I hope you continue to find this spiritually edifying, spiritually beneficial for you. And like I said at the beginning, I hope you find it in an opportunity to continue to explore the writings of Ignatius of Antioch and the Church Fathers even more. May God bless, and we'll see you next week.